What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I am joined by Professor Stephanie McCarter of the University of the South, which is where she teaches. She is a professor of classics and also of Latin, but today we're not here to discuss the classroom. We are here to discuss Professor McCarter's new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, I'm very, very excited to be getting into this because I have been seeing this book circulate the internet, circulate Twitter. It's been popping up on my Instagram since about October, I think, of 2022. And it's still not out here in the UK. So this whole conversation is just all of my nerdy questions coming from other translations, unfortunately, I know, and very minimal knowledge of the Ovid Latin choices, and mostly just sort of Latin questions, translation questions, all of that sort of stuff. Now, I do just want to put a note here to say that this is not the only work that Professor Stephanie McCarter has published. She has published a lot of other things, as well as other translations. So I will be putting those in the description below. However, we will be sticking with Ovid today. So, with all that being said, let's just dive right into it, I guess. Professor McCarter, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I always love talking about Ovid, so this is great.
So the first question I ask everybody, to stray a little bit away from Ovid at first, is about your classics background, because I'm really nosy about how people get into classics, and also specifically, I think as well, because my audience is all newbies, they all have their own journeys, and I think a lot of them are really curious about how, professionals and professors and academics like yourself found your segue in. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I would say it comes from sort of two directions. I was always a poetry nerd. Like, I remember being in middle school and just reading poetry and writing down my favorite poems. And so I always just liked literature and studying poetry especially. So I wanted to be a high school English teacher. That was always my goal when I was younger. But then I had to take a foreign language. It was required at my high school. It's required at a lot of high schools. And I remember my mother telling me, why not take Latin? And because that's what she had taken in school. And I thought that was just madness. Why would I take Latin? I had never had any interest in Latin whatsoever. It had never even crossed my mind that I would do such a thing. And I took it, and I did not love it initially, I must say. I still thought, okay, English is definitely my thing. But the more I took of Latin, the more it kind of pulled me away from, studying the English poetry I thought I was destined to study. So I continued taking Latin when I was in college, and it really took me to get to the literature. I loved the language. I thought it was fun, but I liked it on a kind of mathematical level. I liked the formal kind of bits and pieces and figuring out cases, but it didn't hit me in my heart until I got to reading Virgil and Horace. And then from then on, I studied both English literature and classics at university. And then it sort of came time for me to decide which route to go for graduate school. And by that stage, I knew it was going to be classics all the way. And I would say only in recent years have I looked back. And part of that looking back has meant trying to think of ways I could revisit my love for English poetry as I was teaching Latin. And, so I've done quite a bit of looking at reception in my classes. So looking at poets and poetry. And then, just more and more, I wanted to start thinking about ways I could maybe bring translation in and producing my own kind of poetry as a way to engage with the ancient world. So that was part of that journey.
Well, I mean, classics and translation are two totally different disciplines. Like, I studied classics at NYU, so I did Latin on the side of it, which means I'm very used to, and I think people don't realize this, that like when you translate at university as a classicist, you translate these really odd sentences in the way that they're written in the language. They come out weird because they'll come out like, I don't know, like the boat, comma, having been thrown, comma, like it's weird, and you can't be creative with it because that's not the point. The point is to, what does the page say? So how did you end up stumbling into the discipline of translation? Was it through Ovid in order to do this translation, or was it before?
It was actually before that. So I translated Horace, the Odes, the Epodes, and the Carmen Saeculare before I considered even translating Ovid. And when I turned to that project initially, when I started out doing it, it was really difficult to disentangle myself from that very literal translation that we're taught to do in classics courses. And you said it beautifully. I mean, the way that we mimic the Latin participles in a way that's so unnatural in English, right? The worst is for me, like with the ablative absolutes, right? Which has they just come across in a very stilted way when you do them too literally in English. And so when I first started translating, it was very much, reflecting that kind of classroom exercise I make my students do to show me they understand the Latin grammar. So really what helped me more than anything was taking on meter, like formal meter. And it was a wonderful restraint that helped me break free of the wordiness of literal translation that kind of forced me to reframe the lines. And I think gave me the freedom to break out of, literalness. I think as a classicist, I'm always going to incline towards more literal translation, but having the restraint of meter helps. And so when I sat down to do Ovid from the very beginning, I never translated a single line of Ovid that was not in iambic pentameter. It was just very helpful for me. So much so that then I started thinking in iambic pentameter. To me, it felt like it was a constraint, but it helped me break free of the other constraint, which was literal translation.
And something that you said in the author's note of the book, because just so everybody knows, when we're doing this chat, I don't have the book because it's not out in the UK yet. So I've pre-ordered it, but I got a chance on Amazon. They let you look inside, So I got the little introduction in the notes. And something that you said, sort of leading on from what you just said now, is that when it came to the idioms and things like that in Ovid, you had to pull away. And so you had to sort of, modernize those things because obviously lots of those don't hit then with the modern audience. And you were thinking about the students that were going to then read this and study this possibly as a translation and something that will then relate to them. But I'm wondering, did you get classics guilt doing that when you're pulling away from all of this and you're like, oh, this is going to be so good, but the classicist in me is saying that's not on the page?
Well, I hope that everything I did, I can at least point to the page. Some of this was around the language of sexual violence, right? I mean, how do you say rape in Latin, right? And so if I were going to do a super literal translation of that, sometimes I feel like it would obscure what was actually happening. So one example of that is when Jupiter rapes Io, and Ovid literally says he stole her pudor. But to me, if I did that very literally, he stole her chastity, it sounds almost like a bad kind of Victorian bodice ripper kind of, I don't know, it just, to me, it did not sound like what it was and what the Latin was saying. So I guess for me, a helpful delineation for me was knowing that there was a difference between literal translation and accurate translation. And sometimes the literal, super literal translation simply wasn't accurate to my own time and place. And certainly for my students, I think it would have caused more puzzlement than letting them know what Ovid meant in a given line. So, to me, it was just handy to think, is this accurate versus is this literal? But it's been actually very helpful for me in the classroom. I mean, because I teach, I'm teaching 3 classes right now, and 2 of them are in Latin. So one is a class on Lucretius, and then one is an intermediate Latin class. And it's been so helpful for me just to frame my goals for them becoming translators. I mean, so often what we do in class is to translate. And I don't feel like I've ever been able to justify that exercise as well as I can now. For years, it was just show me that you understand the Latin. But for me now, I can explain to them, I want you to show me that you can bring 2 cultures into conversation with one another. And translation is a great way to do that. And so it's really led to fabulous conversations with my students, even on the level of a word, right? How to translate a word brings out so many interesting windows into Roman culture, right? And to our own culture. So it's really a great exercise to think about with students.
I was going to ask that because, so I mean, I'm not the best at Latin. Like I did Virgil at university. We did like the Eclogues. We did, you know, the Aeneid. We did a lot of also Cicero, as everyone does. And then you do a lot of Caesar and all of that. And then literally I left the classroom and I was like, I'm never going to translate Latin again. Now I've started a YouTube channel like every week. I'm like, let me just check what that says in Latin. But the issue I find is that there are these, like, there are moments of real specificity, really specific moments even with Latin, where they'll use a specific word and then we don't have the word in English for it, but we have like 4 or 5 options, you know, that you can kind of choose, but that will change the whole feel of either the paragraph or the sentence. And for me, I find there's stress with that, because then I'm like, well, what if I even for like really basic ones, like Kylum, for example, you know, it's like, it could be sky or it could be heavens. Yeah. Like one sounds really beautiful and one just sounds like the sky. So you've got to be really specific with that. When it comes to translating Ovid, were there moments like that you just kind of had to look at something and say, okay, we're actually going to rework this whole paragraph in order to make this word make sense? Or was it sort of a tit for tat?
You know, I think part of it was me trying to dig into the concepts behind some of the words. So one of the words I could really illustrate this with nicely, I think, is the language, this word in Latin, which is candidus, which often gets translated as white, but it doesn't really mean that. It's more about brightness. And so, for example, when the sun is at noon and it's shining really high above you, the word that's used to describe that is it's candidus, it's bright, right? And so then this word gets used to describe skin quite a bit. And so then you have to ask yourself, do I say white here, or is there another way I can go about this to get across what Ovid really meant? And I try to avoid the idea of, you know, using the word white, because of course we use that in such a racialized way today. And so if you're just translating, you know, sometimes a single word is packed with so much cultural baggage. And so I tried to use like glowing skin a lot, or if I did think it was suggesting paleness, I said pale. I tried to really back away from, you know, words that were heavily racialized and things like that, where they aren't in the Latin. So to me, I had to be, I think, aware all the time that I could argue that I was doing a literal translation that was justified, but you have to bring the cultures to bear on one another. And I didn't want to mislead people into thinking that, you know, the Romans racialized the concept of whiteness in the same way we do today. So, you know, it was just this constant trying to be aware of how the cultures were in conversation with one another. When, you know, in Ovid, I think that, you know, the idea of, you know, glowing skin was much more about, you know, gendering somebody than anything to do with any kind of like actual literal skin hue, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And something I find in my comment section a lot, because I did a whole series breaking down the Iliad and the Odyssey, like chapter by chapter. It's really for students of like, in case you get really lost, come to this video type of thing. But the question I get asked the most is people asking about the epithets of like white-armed hero.
Right.
Because people will assume that it's like a color thing. I'm like, it's actually an indoor thing. Like, and how do you explain it's an indoor thing when that concept doesn't really exist like today, you know?
Right.
And so it is always a difficult thing. So that's really interesting, actually, that you had to do that in Latin.
Yeah. I mean, it's there a lot, you know, and I think when you get, so my next project is going to be Catullus, and he has this very famous poem. I know I'm a little bit, that one is going to definitely require me to think heavily about my own culture and in ways that, and use words I'm going to find uncomfortable, I think, to use. But, you know, there's this famous poem where Catullus says to Julius Caesar, I don't care. And it looks like he's saying, I don't care if you're black or white. And of course, that sounds totally different to modern ears than how he meant it. What he's probably saying is something to do with his gender role, right? And so then how do you translate that in a way that is true and accurate as opposed to literal, where the literal version is not going to be true and accurate to what Catullus actually meant.
Now, there's part of this conversation I really wanted to use to talk about was, because you've said this to so many other people, is that you had specific words that you really wanted to make sure were translated correctly, shall we say. So like, forceful rape, those sorts of words. So when it came to those rules and going about Ovid, because something that I think is really interesting about the Metamorphoses is that he doesn't have like it's an epic poem, but there's no central character, there's no central narrative. And so in a way, because I've never translated it, I wouldn't know, but do those words then change throughout the poem? Because then they'll change throughout book to book, character to character. And if you wanted to stick to them, what were the challenges with doing that across this very kind of specific epic poem?
Right. I would say that Ovid is remarkably careful with the vocabulary that he uses across the epic. And this is a huge challenge for translators. When you come across the same word, if it's a key word, do you translate it the same way every single time, right? And so, I know for every translator of the Aeneid, pietas, piety, is going to be the word that they're going to have to wrangle with. And I think, Shadi Barsh spoke about this in her translator's note to her Aeneid version. She just had to go with piety, right? And pious, even though it doesn't quite get the complexity of it in each situation. So one word that I had to tangle with in this particular epic was the word, it seems so simple, vis, V-I-S, and it means like force, and that's it, force. We get the word violence from it, and it has so many different connotations in both Roman culture and the epic. It is something that you exercise against often another person's body, so it's kind of physical, but it's also as close as Ovid can come to rape. And so I tried to translate it in a way that, because it was such an important word, that would suggest force throughout, and that force might be some kind of physical violence, but it could be particularly sexual violence. And so, I think that in terms of trying to maintain something across the epic, that was one thing I was trying to maintain. Other things, might be something in book 3 was the word imago, which means it means image, most literally, but it can also mean like a reflection. It can also mean an echo. And so when you have a story, book 3 with Narcissus and Echo, right? One is obsessed with his reflection, and then the other can only offer echoes, then that word becomes really, really important. And so I tried to maintain the way that I translated that across that particular book. And so it might not be a word that I tried to maintain across the entire epic, but certainly, given its importance within a particular section, I was very aware of how I wanted to translate it and maintain that translation across that section, at least.
Is that word used specifically for Echo and Narcissus in that one?
Yeah, and it's in the first lines of the poem, because this is just after Jupiter has put on the sort of bull disguise and taken Europa off into the sea. And at the opening of book 3, it says that he had put aside the imago of the bull. And so there I had to translate it like likeness, because there it meant disguise, right? I could have translated it as disguise, but that wouldn't have prepared you for the idea of the imago in the rest of the book. So throughout that whole book, I translated imago as likeness. So Narcissus sees his own likeness in the water, things like that, so that I could try to really emphasize that. But yeah, Ovid plays with that word throughout, that it's just the imago that is throughout that whole book.
Something I was also really wondering is that, because there are so many myths in this book, right? That's sort of the point. For those of you guys who haven't read Ovid, right, that is literally the point of the Metamorphoses. So what I was thinking, because I have my favorite myths, which I can then out a little bit later. But I was wondering then, when you get to the Latin and you've got to translate that myth, and maybe it's a little bit more negative in the Latin than the original translation that you had read, and you're like, oh no, I really love this myth and I didn't want it to be so dark, and now it's dark. Like, how do you then tackle with that when you're faced with the Latin that you're like, I really wish that this character could have been the hero, but unfortunately this word is used?
Right. I think that I don't ever have, I generally am prepared not to put any classical character on a pedestal to begin with. I tend to know that most of them, even someone like Aeneas in the Aeneid has super disturbing aspects, right? I think that, for a lot of people, to study the ancient world has been to find values and characters to emulate, right? Models for behavior. I've never looked at the ancient past in that way. And as soon as I get find myself admiring a character, I realized pretty quickly that there are too many problems there for me to offer them such admiration. You know, why I struggle about this more with writers than with characters in a myth, I would say. So for Horace, for example, who is probably my first love when it comes to classics. Like, I love Horace. He's not for everybody, but there are certain poems that make me feel very close to him as a character in his own poems. And then there's other poems where I feel completely repelled by him, you know, his sort of imperialistic attitude and things like that. You know, I think with Ovid too, there are moments in translating Ovid where I felt like he was being very sympathetic towards the victims of power, right? Where I felt like he was on my side in a way that he would, you know, was sympathetic towards women especially. And then there are other moments where it just, you know, it's unclear which side he actually is on, and he almost seems to present the violence through a kind of voyeuristic sort of gaze. So, I mean, to me, part of that was just accepting that my relationship with Ovid had to be quite complex and not one-sided, and I could never ever just fall into the I think, to me, like, the temptation to only admire the text that I was translating. I had to be really critical of it, and especially when it came to the moments of sexual violence, and you know, and being very clear, not wanting to just hold those, you know, I wanted to be very, again, critical and willing to hold up a negative light on the text itself.
I have two questions leading on from that, but we'll go with the one about sexual violence, because
Sure.
Something that I heard you speaking about, which I thought was so interesting, was how when you were translating not only sexual violence, but just assault in many different ways, that you would then go back to the text and you would see that what translators had done previously is like add in adjectives that weren't there. One, was that a really weird thing to realize, that you were like, these words are literally not on the page, where did these come from? And also, why was it so important to you in those moments to really stick to, this is the word that's on the page and this is all I'm giving you?
Right. Yes. I mean, this was a lot for me to realize. And I think that it didn't occur to me how much had been sort of added or altered or euphemized until I was teaching Ovid regularly in my course on women and gender in the ancient world. And then I also teach a course on sex and sexuality in the ancient world, where we're looking at a lot of Ovid. And with my students, we had read the Leucothoe story. And so it was writing about this that actually sort of got me into translating Ovid in particular. But to me, it is such a clear-cut story of rape, and Ovid uses almost formulaic language to say she was raped. But when I looked at the translations, it was just not there at all in so many of the translations, and it became shockingly not there. I mean, you have some of these translators saying that, you know, she's welcoming his invasion, you know, she's shuddering at his manliness. I mean, it's just not there at all. And so then this became the way I taught that scene. And so for years with my students, I would put up the different translations and I would say, you know, tell me what's happening. And they would be very confused. And then I would show them the Latin. And these are my students in a Latin class quite often. And they would just say, oh my gosh, they just so immediately would see the difference. So part of that, you know, wanting to reflect these scenes accurately was, again, from the fact that I'm a classics professor who's translating this. And I teach this in Latin. And so much of it in my classroom is about, you know, accurate translation. I don't feel like I came into this project allowing myself a huge degree of license when it came to these episodes in particular. Like, I wanted to get them in there very clearly. It wasn't just though in scenes of sexual violence, it was also in scenes describing like the gendered body. And this is where I found this really surprised me. So, you know, Daphne, for instance, doesn't just have fingers in some of these translations. She has delicate fingers, right? I talked before about, you know, the dangers of putting, you know, adjectives like white in there to describe skin. Sometimes that word was thrown in there when there was no description of the skin in Latin at all. I'm thinking of the Rayburn translation, when he has bark going up Daphne, he has it going over her white skin. Well, that's just not even there in the Latin period. I saw this a lot with breasts, which Ovid rarely mentions, I will say, in the Metamorphoses. They are everywhere in the translations. I could give you two quick examples of this if you want, but one that I've talked about is Mira's nurse. This is when Mira has attempted suicide, and her nurse, who has been with her whole life, pulls her down out of the noose and then tries to get her to tell her what is wrong. And part of her strategy for this is to show her breasts. And this is to remind her that she has nursed her since she was a baby. And you see characters in the Iliad do this, like Hecuba, before Hector goes out to fight Achilles, she exposes her breasts. This is a maternal moment, right? And so Ovid tells us that her breasts are inania, which means empty, right? She's not nursing her anymore, but it reminds you of the fact that she once did. But other translators would give this an aesthetic quality, so that she has old, useless breasts, is how Rolfe Humphreys translates it. But or flaccid, withered, these sort of things. So it's not reminding you of her nursing past; it's making you think that she's got a disgusting old body, right? And so to me, it was like trying to think through these things a bit more carefully and making sure that I wasn't just looking at these bodies through a male gaze, and that I was thinking about how these adjectives characterize these people as opposed to just how they make them look. But one of my favorite examples of this is that, often women just have a pectus, like a chest, right? This may or may not, maybe there are, these chests are everywhere in the epic, and certainly for women, breasts are a part of the general area, but that's not what Ovid is putting our eyes on, right? So in book 8, he has one of his great personified abstracts, which is hunger. And so he's describing the body of hunger, and she looks really skeletal. And he says that she has a pectus on top of a spinal column. And so she has this sort of rib cage, is what I'm envisioning, with just this skin on top of it. And every translator gives her, I don't want to say every, because there's probably one that doesn't, but most translators give her these long, dangling, pendulous, flaccid breasts instead of a chest. And I just didn't see that at all. So this was this sort of thing where after I did my translation and I went back, I was flabbergasted that this is how other people were envisioning her.
I was going to ask you about this because, okay, Erysichthon, or Eric, however you would say that. Yeah, right? That's my favorite myth in the whole book, which is a really odd choice, I know. But it was one of the first ones that I ever read when I was 13 in my classics class. And I was like, this is the wildest story I've ever read, like ever. From start to finish, it doesn't let up. And then you get to the last line, it's like, and then he ate himself. And you're like, oh, that's the end? Like, what's going on? But I was going to ask you about hunger, because that personification to me is so interesting, because Ovid at least was the first one, or maybe the only one that I've ever read who's done hunger in such a way. Yeah. And having her be on the opposite side of this like plane to Demeter, because they can't be too close to one another because one is the goddess of plenty and the other is the goddess of hunger, and how they like work together. That goes back to kind of like what we were talking about with favorites, that like that for me, for example, was my favorite myth. And there are so many images in that are just iconic in my opinion. And I don't know if I could translate that correctly, because I would end up making that whole thing a comedic performance, because I think it's one of the funniest myths ever, because it's just so odd, right, in my opinion. So that's where like my own biases, I think, would totally cloud me as a translator. That's where that initial question came from, was from Erysichthon.
Well, I think we're allowed to have biases. We can't rid ourselves entirely of our biases when we're translating. I think that what we have failed to do is acknowledge them, right? And so we had this idea of objective translation as an ideal, and we've so often taken that for granted, that these translators are just objective, what's interesting to me is that when women have gotten involved in translation, we've accused them of having biases, like, oh, her feminist biases are clearly getting in the way here. But I actually think that if you, if you are trying to set kind of feminist goals for yourself when it comes to things like sexual violence in the body, and gender and all of that stuff, sexuality, and you're informed by lots of scholarship on those topics, then you can actually not become more objective, but you can have less, be less clouded by your biases, if that makes sense. So, to me, saying, I don't want to just look at these characters through a male gaze. So I don't want that to be my bias, right? So to me, I think that you can try to be more accurate by owning your biases and scrutinizing them, acknowledging that you have them and trying to deal with them. I think the problem is where you just assume that Ovid is a reflection of your own way of looking at the world, and that you can have him describe women who are pointedly asexual as having these qualities of sexiness according to our own culture. When you just assume that you can do that, you have to be very careful, I think, by scrutinizing your biases. So like that you would need to perhaps wonder within that particular scene, well, is it actually funny? I think it actually is a bit funny, but yeah, so I think we just need to acknowledge the fact that there is no such thing as an objective reading or an objective translation.
So which is your favorite story from Ovid's Metamorphoses?
Gosh, I think that probably, I will say that my answer before I translated that would reflect in no way my current answer. So yeah, when I was going into it, I don't know what my favorite story would have been going in. Maybe, I don't know, I liked things like Daedalus and Icarus and some of these that were actually not about, sexual violence and rape. That wouldn't have been my favorite to teach. I find that Daedalus and Icarus is actually an extremely difficult story to teach for some reason. The ones I like to teach were things like Salmachus and Hermaphroditus. I loved doing the whole sort of all the Miniads stories. So Pyramus and Thisbe, Salmachus and Hermaphroditus. But if you ask me my favorite now, it's actually the Sais and Alcyone story, the king and queen of Trachis, who are kind of separated. He has to go on a sea voyage and he dies, and then he washes back to shore, and they turn into halcyons as she flies out to his dead body. But I love that so much because it's one of Ovid's great stories of mutual desire. And I didn't realize until I actually translated these things how amazing Ovid is at telling stories of mutual love. And to me, this is one thing that actually made me love the text a lot more, that yes, he gives us lots of stories of sexual violence, but he offers us a foil to that in these stories of mutual love. Sexual violence usually results from a kind of love that's hierarchical, in which you clearly have someone who has the ability to dominate another person, to enact their will upon their body. It's a really horrid idea of love. But it's just one side of love in the epic. And the other is, a story like Baucis and Philemon, where Ovid tells us very clearly, like, you could look for slaves and masters in that house, you're not going to find them because there's two people and they're equal, right? He says both alike give orders and obey. But at any rate, with Ceyx and Alcyone, what I really love about that is that so often you get the one-sided erotic gaze where a man is looking at a woman, and often this anticipates sexual violence, right? But here you get Alcyone and Ceyx, they're just looking at each other all the time. Even as he's dying on the ocean, he's looking towards her, and she's standing on the shore looking towards him. When as he's leaving, she's watching him sail away, and even when she can't see him, she can picture him in her mind. And I think that's just lovely. And then when he's washing back as a corpse, she watches him wash ashore. So it's just this circular gaze that doesn't objectify, but speaks to mutual passion and love, and being the interiority of these characters. And so I just thought I think it's grand. I think it's a wonderful story. And also, to me, it's a kind of takes on the Orpheus and Eurydice story. Orpheus is trying to bring her back to life, but we have that one-sided gaze where he turns around. He can't just picture her in his mind's eye for a moment. Whereas Ceyx and Alcyone they have this mutual gaze, and that love does what Orpheus can't. Ceyx is dead and he comes back to life. So that love achieves what Orpheus's love can't, which I think is really interesting.
I mean, that was so beautiful, but which was then like your least favorite myth going into it that maybe changed your mind as you were translating it then? If you have like, if your favorite changed so much, then could your least favorite also change?
I think so. So if you had asked me which one I hate to teach, which one I wasn't into that much, it would have been the long debate between Ajax and Ulysses. Like, I just wasn't there for it. And it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines long. And I knew, like, for years that I was going to have to do that. But when I got, and I mean, it has all these allusions back to the Iliad, and it's the whole Trojan War encapsulated in these two people's long speeches. But oh my God, that was so fun to translate. I mean, it was the act of having to translate that actually made me like it. Odysseus, he's so over the top. He's such can I say an ass? I mean, he's such an ass. And he uses rhetoric as a weapon. And you can hear just Ajax's frustration. I mean, he's so truthful in a way. He's where Odysseus is so duplicitous, Ajax is almost naive that he can win this armor through just deserving it. So, and to me, and it was, Ovid is pulling out lots of his rhetorical training in those speeches. And so to a degree, I think that I had to translate them and try to reproduce the rhetoric of the speeches to really get to a point where I could appreciate them. That was grand fun. I loved it.
Well, that just reminded me of something, like when it comes to Latin, that sometimes, and I can't remember what this is, I don't know why this line came to mind. It might be Lucan. Nobody quote me on that because it might be wrong. But like sometimes when you read Latin, it physically, like they'll be describing an image, but it will physically show an image as well. And the line I'm thinking of, again, wherever it's from, is that it was a boat going through these like two rocks, but the rocks were on either side of the sentence. Then you have the words for ships and sea all in the middle of that. So there is that element of like being able to see and also read what you're supposed to be seeing, if that makes sense. And Ovid is so vivid in his images. Were there any moments like that you saw sort of an image being shown in the sentence structure that you were like, oh, I can't put this in the English because we don't do that in English, but if only people could see?
Oh goodness, I'm not going to be able to think of one of Ovid right now because my brain is stuck in Horace at this particular moment. But yeah, so those word pictures is what I call them. I know I talked about word pictures with my students in Ovid last semester, and for some reason my brain is not gripping onto one. But in Horace, he has this beautiful one where these two young lovers are embracing in a cave on a bed of roses, and the line mimics that. But it's something that Latin can achieve because it is inflected. Everything is done through word endings. And so you can put the words anywhere in the sentence that you want. And in English, it's impossible because we're so confined by word order. And so I tried to think of a way I could at least reproduce that a little bit. And I did that. I mean, my first impulse was like, okay, I can make the words do that. I can will English to bend to my to bend to this, but you can't. And I've accepted the fact that you can't often translate these into English. But what I did try to do in some instances was to mimic that a little bit through alliteration. So at least to try to get the kind of, often these are chiastic, so like A, B, B, A. And even if I couldn't arrange the words chiastically, I could at least perhaps give a tiny hint of something through having chiastic alliteration or interlocking alliteration or something like that. I mean, it's one of those things where you have to make compromises and things are simply going to get lost because it's in the effort sometimes to keep everything that you end up making garbled bad English. So what could I try to substitute in there with something to think about?
Now, how do you feel as the person behind this book, knowing that this is going to be so many people's translation? Because I mean, I've read a bunch of books that are taking, the stories of Ovid and that redo them. I've reviewed and interviewed Nina McLaughlin for her Wake Siren, which was beautiful.
Lovely.
And as well, I reviewed Ali Smith's, oh God, is it Boy Meets Girl or Girl Meets Boy?
Every time, every single time. I think that's part of the interesting thing about it. I just think you're supposed to do that. I think with that particular book.
It's one of those titles, but I've spoken about them on the channel. But you can't obviously use those as source material, like that's for people who want to get into it. And this is a new translation of Ovid, so yours will now be someone's source material in order to write a book like that. How does that feel?
Well, you hit something that I think most classicists do not think about much, is that, well, first of all, a lot of classicists don't think about reception enough. And I don't think we've thought about the possibilities for interdisciplinarity enough when it comes to creative writing. So some of my students I love talking about the most about Ovid are the creative writers at Sewanee, because we've got a really good creative writing program and strong writers here as students. And when I actually gave a talk at the Society for Classical Studies meeting in New Orleans, and one of the things I talked about was the fact that someone like Nina McLaughlin, she was reading Alan Mandelbaum's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Ali Smith, she gave an interview with Desert Island Discs, I think is the name of it. It's a BBC radio program. And she said that if she could take any book with her to a deserted island, it would be Mary Innes's Ovid translation. So I mean, clearly it's not just that this will be the translation of the Ovidian text for people who will read Ovid. It's also it could be the source material, as you say, for people who are going on to write these adaptations. That to me is the most exciting prospect. I would love for this. And in fact, a friend of mine, Sherry Maggot, she's already written a play along with a collaborator, Sarah Baskin, who's an actress, and they put together a play that was sort of inspired by the translation. The goal to make these rapes very accurate. So, I mean, to me, to be a part of that dialogue with creative writers is fabulously exciting. I tend to think that we when we are working in academia, we envision only other academics reading our work and building upon our work. And I think we need to think much more broadly about the different audiences and readers that we can engage with. And so that was another part of my motivation for turning to translation, was that I wanted to really speak beyond the narrow confines of the ivory tower. I personally have been getting more and more disenchanted with that narrow audience, because I think that if we're only speaking to each other and we're not speaking outside of academia, well, then that's not good for the field at all. And it's already a field that's in peril. We need to be engaging with as many forms of reception as we can. And a lot of academics, they look down on modern rewrites as inaccurate versions of the myth or something like that. Whereas I'm thinking, these are the very people who are doing what Ovid himself was doing, which is taking old stories and reimagining them for a new time and place, a whole new set of problems, a whole new kind of politics. And to me, there's no area that's more exciting than doing that. And I think that translation does something similar, right? You're transforming Ovid for a new time and place that has concerns that intersect with Ovid's concerns and themes, but that aren't entirely the same. So it's a great way, again, to get cultures talking to each other. And by doing that, we can learn not just about Rome and Roman culture, but we can learn about ourselves. And translation is a great place where we can do that.
To start winding down this chat, though, one thing I really wanted to ask after hearing all of hearing you talk about all of those things was, you have at least a note in the introduction. I have no idea about this throughout the book, but you have a fascination with the idea of the connection of the body and the self that you really wanted to explore throughout your study of Ovid, which is something that until I read it, and this is going to sound so dumb, I never thought about when reading Ovid. Like, I was never thinking, you know, oh, when that character changes into, when Echo, since we've mentioned Echo, when she changes into a rock, is she still Echo, or is she now a rock? Right. So what made you really fascinated with that part of Ovid that made you really wanted to emphasize that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that some people have written about that in terms of Ovid, but I think what made me in particular made me interested about this in particular is the fact that we are having this conversation now. Like, what is the relationship between the body and the self, right? It's such a fascinating question. We're thinking about this a lot in terms of gender, right? You know, to what degree does the body you were born with necessitate how you live your life within that body and who you are within that body? It's such a fascinating question. And you know, and it just permeates this epic. And I think it's one reason that Ovid has so appealed to us and intrigued us, because it invites us to think, well, what does it mean to have a body? What does it mean to walk around in the world with a vulnerable body that has some relationship to who we are on the inside, but that we've never been able to completely put our finger on, right? Even in the closing lines, it's his own body that he puts in these terms. He says, you know, I will die, but a more important part of me will live on, right? What is the relationship between Ovid and himself and his poem, right? This is a great question. What, even in the opening lines, it's as though the universe itself has a body, right? Where he says that all nature had the same face, right? The vultus in Latin. So I mean, it makes you think, like, what is a body? What does it represent? What is a personality within that body? And also, like, what is the relationship between someone in power and how they affect the body? So, you know, if someone in power might have control over your body, but do they have control over your being? And that's a really important question, I think, that Ovid makes us ponder and ask. And, you know, these are the questions that transcend from his time to ours, right? I mean, I think he was being informed by his unique Roman concerns when he was asking those questions. I mean, I think that he can't have lived through the metamorphosis from republic to empire without thinking about the ways that the Roman body had a whole series of changes about who could control it, right? So Augustus kind of was in a position of power that did not exist before, and that power was over the bodies of free citizens in a way that it had not been before. So I think that Ovid is thinking about this as a Roman, but we don't have to think about it that way. We can apply our own kind of cultural lens into those same questions. And so, to me, it's one of the most fascinating things about the epic, and one of the reasons we need to continue reading it. Because I do think for my students, it's a moment in which they realize that they're still part of a conversation that's been going on for so long. And they love thinking about the relationship between the body and identity. It's a moment when the text becomes very personal, because I think that lots of us are thinking about that in terms of our own lives all the time. You know, I even think, you know, I'm reaching middle age. Like, what is the relationship between my identity and my body as my body ages, right? I'm in my mid 40s, and you know, I think this is a kind of transitional time. And so, what does this metamorphosis mean in terms of my identity? And I think you see that in the Pythagoras speech in book 15, where he really brings this sort of theme of metamorphosis to bear upon the human body and the cycles of life. I mean, to me, it's just a spectacular theme. It's great.
Well, my final question is, and it comes from a place of, again, my audience are newbies and they are just getting into the subject. They read along with my videos. It's like the cutest, most heartwarming little community that I'm obsessed with. And so I always like to end on a piece of advice that you, as a professor who they wouldn't have had access to without this video, especially when it comes to Latin and Ovid specifically, maybe not Latin, we'll just keep it with Ovid. What's your advice for them? Because, you know, a lot of them might not have heard of Ovid's Metamorphoses until, you know, hearing this talk. They might have just been opened up to a whole new world. What advice would you give them to go into Ovid that might help them?
I think that one thing that would be interesting to do is to find one of the myths that you really like and explore it, right? So go from Ovid and look at the way that myth has been handled in art, right? So say you like Daedalus and Icarus, that's been painted, that's been sculpted. You might want to look at that. How has this been rewritten? So, you know, if you like Apollo and Daphne, you could look at so many ways this story has been rewritten. So Nina McLaughlin rewrites it. A.E. Stallings has some fantastic poems based on this. Mark Prynne's new book, The Latinist, that was out not long ago. I think there's another one by another novel, but you could just explore that myth and see how it's been rewritten. I think that would be a great way to spend some time without thinking that you have to. I mean, this epic, this is a brick, and it can be a little daunting to think that you have to absorb everything in it. But you might just want to absorb a myth. And if we think of Ovid as engaging in conversations that have been going on for a long time, you can explore that myth from before Ovid took it up to when he took it up, see how this was handled by later writers, you know, in the Renaissance, all the way up until your own day. I think that would be a good way to go about it.
That is honestly such a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much. Again, I know that I constantly say thank you, but thank you so much again for joining me, for sitting down and for having this chat, for not only me and my curiosity, but also to, you know, give this then to my audience and to put it out to my YouTube family. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so pleased.
If this conversation has convinced you to check out the new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, as I said at the start of this video, please go and check out the description below. All of the links will be down there. If you guys are in the US, you can order this book. If you guys are in the UK, you, like me, will have to pre-order the book. But alas, all of the links are in the description below, as well as Professor McCarter's Twitter account and her website if you guys want to find other ways of contacting her and for being up to date with, you know, everything that comes with publishing and classics. You can find all of that down there. But thank you guys so much for joining me for this chat. Thank you guys so much for engaging in the comments, for liking this video and subscribing. I do massively appreciate all of the support on this channel. And we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.